Johnny Cash had to choose between his biggest concert of the year and saving Carl Perkins' life. What he did next proved what real friendship means. August 15th, 1977, the Civic Center in Charleston, West Virginia. 18,000 people were packed into the arena, waiting to see Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins perform together on what was being billed as the Legends of Rockabilly tour. It was the biggest concert of either man's career, a sold-out show that represented months of planning, hundreds of thousands of dollars in production costs, and the culmination of a friendship that had lasted 23 years. In 45 minutes, Johnny and Carl were supposed to walk on stage together and prove that rockabilly music was still alive, still vital, still capable of moving audiences the way it had in the 1950s. Instead, Johnny Cash was standing in Carl Perkins' dressing room, looking down at his best friend who was unconscious, barely breathing, and dying from an overdose of pills and alcohol. And Johnny had exactly 60 seconds to make the most important decision of both their lives. To understand what happened in that dressing room, you need to understand the friendship between Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins. And you need to understand how two men who had conquered their demons together could find themselves back in hell, fighting for their lives all over again. Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins first met in 1955 at Sun Records in Memphis. Johnny was the new guy, the tall, dark stranger from Arkansas with the deep voice and the simple songs. Carl was already established, the rockabilly pioneer who had written Blue Suede Shoes and helped invent a whole new kind of music. They should have been competitors. Both were young, both were hungry, both were trying to make it in the cutthroat world of 1950s music. Instead, they became brothers. Carl saw something in Johnny that reminded him of himself, a poor kid from the South who loved music more than anything else in the world, who was willing to work harder than anyone else to make it, who understood that music wasn't just entertainment, but salvation. Johnny saw in Carl everything he wanted to be as a musician, authentic, innovative, uncompromising. Carl didn't just play rockabilly. He had helped create it. He had taken country music and black rhythm and blues and mixed them together into something completely new, something that made kids want to dance and parents want to call the police. By 1956, they were touring together regularly. Johnny would open for Carl, or Carl would open for Johnny, depending on who had the bigger hit at the moment. But more often than not, they would end up on stage together, trading verses, harmonizing, creating magic that neither could produce alone. The friendship went deeper than music. Carl became the older brother Johnny had never had. When Johnny was struggling with his marriage to Vivian, Carl was there to listen. When Johnny was fighting his addiction to amphetamines, Carl was there to help. When Johnny was questioning his faith, his purpose, his place in the world, Carl was there to remind him who he was and why he mattered. Carl, in turn, found in Johnny the audience he'd always needed. Johnny understood Carl's music in ways that critics and fans never could. Johnny knew that Blue Suede Shoes wasn't just a silly song about footwear. It was a manifesto about pride, about dignity, about the right of poor kids to have something beautiful that belonged to them. For 20 years, they had been each other's anchor, each other's conscience, each other's support system. When Johnny got clean from pills in the late 1960s, Carl was there to celebrate. When Carl's career hit rough patches in the 1970s, Johnny was there to offer encouragement and opportunities. But by 1977, something had gone wrong with Carl Perkins, and Johnny was watching his best friend destroy himself with the same demons that had nearly killed Johnny a decade earlier. Carl's addiction had started innocuously enough, the way these things always do. A few drinks to calm his nerves before shows, some pills to help him sleep after the adrenaline rush of performing, a little something to take the edge off the disappointment when a record didn't chart, when a show was canceled, when younger musicians got the recognition that Carl felt he deserved. By 1977, Carl Perkins was drinking a bottle of whiskey every day and taking enough pills to kill a horse. He was showing up to concerts drunk, forgetting lyrics, missing chord changes, embarrassing himself and everyone around him. Johnny had tried everything. He'd talked to Carl about the drinking, about the pills, about the way he was throwing his life away. Carl would promise to get clean, would stay sober for a few weeks, and then would relapse harder than before. Johnny had arranged for Carl to go to treatment centers. Carl would check in, stay for a few days, and then check himself out, claiming he was fine, that he just needed to get back to work. Johnny had threatened to stop working with Carl if he didn't get help. Carl would get angry, accuse Johnny of being controlling, of not understanding the pressures he was under. Nothing worked. Carl kept getting worse, and Johnny kept watching his best friend disappear into the bottom of a bottle. The Legends of Rockabilly tour was supposed to be Carl's comeback, his chance to prove that he still mattered, that rockabilly music still had an audience. Johnny had personally guaranteed the promoters that Carl would be clean, professional, and ready to perform. For the first 3 shows of the tour, Carl had managed to hold it together. He was drinking, but he wasn't drunk. He was taking pills, but he wasn't unconscious. He was shaky, unpredictable, sometimes forgetting words or missing cues, but he was functional. Charleston was supposed to be different. Charleston was the biggest show of the tour, the one that would be recorded for a potential live album, the one that could relaunch both of their careers. Johnny arrived at the venue at 4 p.m. for sound check. Carl was supposed to meet him there, but he didn't show up. Johnny waited an hour, then then sent someone to Carl's hotel room. Carl wasn't there either. At 6 p.m., 2 hours before showtime, Carl finally arrived at the venue. Johnny took one look at his friend and knew there was a problem. Carl was weaving slightly as he walked. His eyes were glassy, and his speech was slurred. "Carl, are you okay?" "I'm fine, Johnny. Never better. Ready to rock and roll." But Carl wasn't fine. He was drunk and high and getting worse by the minute. Johnny tried to sober Carl up. He poured coffee down his throat and made him take a cold shower, had him walk around the backstage area to get his blood flowing. Nothing worked. Carl kept getting more incoherent, more unsteady, more obviously intoxicated. At 7:30, 30 minutes before showtime, Johnny made the decision to go on alone. He would tell the audience that Carl was sick, that he couldn't perform, that Johnny would do a solo acoustic set instead. But when Johnny went to Carl's dressing room to tell him the plan, he found something that made his blood run cold. Carl was unconscious in his chair, his head lolled back, barely breathing. There was an empty bottle of whiskey on the table next to him, along with a scattered pile of pills, uppers, downers, pain medication, everything Carl had been able to get his hands on. Johnny checked Carl's pulse. It was weak and irregular. He checked Carl's breathing. It was shallow and labored. Carl Perkins was dying, and he was dying right now. Johnny had faced this moment before, with his own addiction, in his own darkest hours. He knew what overdose looked like, knew how quickly it could kill someone, knew that Carl had maybe minutes left before it was too late to save him. Johnny also knew that 18,000 people were waiting for them to perform. The promoters had invested huge amounts of money in this show. The crew had worked for months to make it happen. The fans had traveled from hundreds of miles away to see the legends of Rockabilly together. If Johnny called an ambulance, if he canceled the show, if he admitted that Carl Perkins was dying from a drug overdose, it would destroy both of their careers. It would be front-page news across the country. It would confirm every negative stereotype about rock and roll musicians, about the lifestyle, about the self-destruction. But if Johnny didn't call an ambulance, Carl Perkins would die. Johnny looked at his watch. 7:45 p.m. 15 minutes until showtime. The opening act was finishing their set. The stage manager would be coming to get them any minute. Johnny made his decision. He called for an ambulance, then he called the promoter. "The show's canceled. Carl is sick. We need to get everyone out of the building." The promoter was furious. "Johnny, you can't cancel now. People are already in their seats. We'll be ruined. Carl is dying. The show is canceled. Can't you just do a solo set? Tell them Carl has the flu or something?" Johnny looked at Carl, who was turning blue around the lips. "No, get everyone out, now." The next 30 minutes were chaos. The promoter had to go on stage and announce to 18,000 disappointed fans that the concert was canceled due to medical emergency. People demanded refunds, threw bottles, cursed Johnny Cash for ruining their evening. Meanwhile, paramedics were working on Carl in his dressing room, trying to stabilize him enough to transport to the hospital. Johnny stayed by Carl's side, holding his hand, talking to him, refusing to leave even when the paramedics said there wasn't room for him in the ambulance. "I'm riding with him," Johnny said. "He's not doing this alone." At Charleston General Hospital, doctors worked for 3 hours to save Carl Perkins' life. They pumped his stomach, gave him IV fluids, monitored his heart rhythm, and waited to see if he would survive the massive overdose. Johnny sat in the waiting room, still wearing his black performance clothes, fielding angry phone calls from promoters, booking agents, and record company executives who wanted to know what the hell had happened to their investment. Johnny's response to all of them was the same. "My friend is more important than your money." At 2 a.m., a doctor finally came out to talk to Johnny. "Mr. Cash, your friend is going to live, but it was close. Another 20 minutes, and we couldn't have saved him." Johnny closed his eyes and said a prayer of gratitude. "Doctor, what happens now?" "Well, medically, he should be fine in a few days. But Mr. Cash, your friend has a very serious addiction problem. This wasn't an accident. This was a cry for help." Johnny nodded. "I know. Can I see him?" Carl was awake but barely coherent. He looked at Johnny with shame and gratitude and confusion all mixed together. "Johnny, what happened? Where am I?" "You're in the hospital, Carl. You almost died." Carl was quiet for a long time, trying to process what Johnny was telling him. "The show. Did we do the show?" "No, Carl. I canceled it." "You canceled it?" Carl's voice was weak but incredulous. "Johnny, that was our biggest show. That was our chance." "Carl, you were dying. You stopped breathing. I had to choose between the show and your life." Carl started crying, deep sobs that shook his whole body. "I'm so sorry, Johnny. I'm so sorry I ruined everything." Johnny sat down in the chair next to Carl's bed. "Carl, you didn't ruin anything, but we need to talk about what happens next." "What do you mean?" Johnny's voice was gentle but firm. "I mean that this can't happen again. I mean that you need to get clean, really clean, and you need to stay clean. I've tried, Johnny. I can't do it." "Yes, you can, but not alone. And not the way you've been trying." Johnny had made a decision during those long hours in the hospital waiting room. He was going to save Carl Perkins, whatever it took. "Carl, I'm going to make you an offer. I'm going to pay for you to go to the best treatment center in the country. Not for a week, not for a month, but for as long as it takes. And when you get out, you're going to come live with June and me until you're strong enough to be on your own." Carl looked at Johnny in amazement. "Johnny, I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking. I'm telling you. This is what's going to happen." "What about your career? What about the tour? over. Johnny's voice was steady. "Carl, I've had a successful career for 20 years. I've made money, I've won awards, I've played in front of millions of people. But none of that means anything if I lose my best friend." Carl was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out and took Johnny's hand. "Why would you do this for me?" Johnny squeezed Carl's hand. "Because 23 years ago, you treated a skinny kid from Arkansas like he mattered. Because you taught me how to play guitar, how to write songs, how to be a man. Because when I was destroying myself with pills, you never gave up on me. Because that's what friends do." The treatment program that Johnny found for Carl was in Minnesota, a 6-month residential facility that specialized in addiction among professional musicians. It wasn't cheap and it wasn't easy, but Johnny paid every penny without complaint. While Carl was in treatment, Johnny dealt with the fallout from the canceled Charleston concert. Promoters sued him for breach of contract. Critics accused him of being unprofessional. Fans felt betrayed and angry. Johnny absorbed it all without fighting back, without making excuses, without throwing Carl under the bus. When reporters asked what had happened, Johnny would simply say, "Carl had a medical emergency. I made the only choice I could make." 6 months later, Carl Perkins came out of treatment clean, sober, and transformed. He moved in with Johnny and June, living in their guest house, attending daily AA meetings, slowly rebuilding his life and his relationship with music. The first time Carl picked up a guitar after treatment, he played blue suede shoes. But this time, it sounded different. It sounded like gratitude. "Johnny," Carl said after he finished the song, "I think I remember why I started playing music." "Why?" "Because it felt good. Because it was fun. Because when I'm playing guitar, I'm not thinking about pills or whiskey or any of the things that were killing me. I'm just thinking about the music." Johnny smiled. "Welcome back, Carl." Carl Perkins stayed sober for the rest of his life. He continued touring and recording, but with a different attitude, a different approach to both music and life. He became a sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous, helping other musicians who were struggling with addiction. More importantly, Carl became proof that intervention works, that friendship can save lives, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to risk everything to save them. The Charleston concert that Johnny canceled was never rescheduled. The Legends of Rockabilly tour was permanently shelved. Johnny lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, damaged relationships with promoters, and faced years of criticism for his decision. But Johnny never regretted it for a moment. "People ask me about my biggest hits, my most successful tours, my greatest achievements," Johnny would later say. "But the thing I'm most proud of is saving Carl's life. Because at the end of the day, none of the rest of it matters if you don't have the people you love." Carl Perkins lived for another 20 years after that night in Charleston. He saw his children grow up, met his grandchildren, continued making music, and became an elder statesman of rockabilly. He credited Johnny Cash with saving not just his life, but his soul. In 1997, at Carl's 65th birthday party, he stood up in front of a room full of family and friends and said, "20 years ago, Johnny Cash had to choose between his career and my life. He chose my life. That's not just friendship, that's love, and it's the reason I'm standing here tonight." Johnny was in the audience that night, and when Carl finished speaking, Johnny stood up and started applauding. Soon, the entire room was on their feet, not just for Carl's recovery, but for the friendship that had made it possible. The decision Johnny made in Carl's dressing room on August 15th, 1977, lasted about 60 seconds, but the impact of that decision lasted for the rest of both men's lives. Johnny Cash proved that night that real friendship isn't about the good times, the successful tours, the sold-out concerts. Real friendship is about being there when everything falls apart, when the world is ending, when the only choice is between convenience and love. Johnny chose love. He canceled the biggest concert of his career, absorbed massive financial losses, and damaged his professional reputation, all to save the life of a friend who was dying in a dressing room. Carl Perkins lived because Johnny Cash understood that some things are more important than show business. And in saving Carl, Johnny saved part of himself, the part that remembered that music is meaningless without the people who make it, that success is empty without friends to share it with, that fame is just noise unless it's used to help the people who matter most. The concert was canceled, the tour was ruined, the money was lost, but Carl Perkins lived, and Johnny Cash proved what real friendship looks like when everything is on the line. Sometimes the most important show you can give is the one where you don't perform at all.